Have you ever held an invitation in your hands that felt less like a request for your presence and more like a declaration of war? That's exactly what happened to Natalie. Picture this: 6 months after being thrown out onto the street by her husband for being too hormonal and pregnant, she gets a heavy cream-colored envelope. It wasn't an apology. It was an invitation to his wedding to the very mistress he destroyed their family for. He thought she would show up broken, pregnant, and alone. He had no idea she was about to arrive with a billionaire on her arm and a secret that would shatter his perfect day. Grab your popcorn, because revenge is a dish best served. Expensive. The rain in Seattle always felt personal to Natalie, but today it felt like the sky was weeping specifically for her. Inside her cramped one-bedroom apartment on 4th Avenue, the air smelled faintly of formula and lavender. It was a chaotic symphony of sounds: the hum of the radiator, the distant wail of a siren, and the synchronized cooing of 3 6-month-old babies lying on a playmat in the center of the living room. Leo, Sam, and Maya, her triplets, her miracles, and the reason her life had imploded. Natalie brushed a stray lock of dark hair from her face, her eyes scanning the pile of mail she had just retrieved from the downstairs box. Most of it was junk coupons for diapers, a utility bill she needed to juggle, and a flyer for a local pizza place. But at the bottom of the stack sat an envelope that looked like it belonged in a museum, not in her trembling hands. It was thick, textured cardstock, sealed with gold wax, stamped with a monogram. She recognized instantly R&T. Richard. And Tiffany. Her breath hitched in her throat. It had been nearly a year since the night that defined her current existence. She closed her eyes, and the memory washed over her, visceral and stinging. Flashback, 11 months ago. "It's just not what I signed up for, Nat," Richard had said, his voice terrifyingly calm as he sipped a scotch in their sprawling minimalist living room in Bellevue. "You're expanding. You're emotional. You're boring." "I'm pregnant, Richard," Natalie had screamed, clutching her stomach. "I'm carrying your child. I'm 4 months along." "And that's the problem," he sneered, standing up and adjusting his bespoke suit jacket. "I wanted a wife, not an incubator. And frankly, Tiffany understands my needs. She's young, she's vibrant, and she's not you." Tiffany, his 22-year-old personal assistant, the one who smiled too much at office parties. "You can't do this," Natalie sobbed, feeling the floor drop out from under her. "Where will I go?" "The prenup is clear," Richard said, coldly checking his watch. "You get the settlement, which is generous considering, and you leave the house. Tonight. Tiffany is moving in tomorrow, and I don't want your maternity clutter ruining the feng shui." He had thrown her out, literally. He had security escort her off the property while it rained her belongings, stuffed into 3 garbage bags. He didn't know then that she wasn't just carrying 1 child. She was carrying 3. And when she tried to tell him a week later, his lawyer sent a cease and desist letter claiming she was using the pregnancy to extort more money, and that Richard wanted a paternity test after the birth before he paid a single cent of child support. End flashback. Natalie opened her eyes, the anger in her chest burning hotter than the radiator. She tore open the wax seal. "Mr. Richard Hall and Miss Tiffany Banks request the pleasure of your company." She laughed, a dry, humorless sound. He was inviting her to his wedding. Why, she flipped the card over. There was a handwritten note on the back in Richard's jagged, arrogant scrawl. "Nat, I know things ended poorly, But I'm a big enough man to extend an olive branch. Come see what real happiness looks like. Bring the kid if you kept it. We'll have a nanny on site so you can actually enjoy a glass of champagne for once. Don't be bitter. Rich. The kid if you kept it, she whispered, her voice shaking. He didn't even know. He didn't know about the triplets. He thought she was just a struggling single mom with one baby living off the scraps of his settlement, which, thanks to his sharks of lawyers, had been drained by medical bills from a high-risk delivery. He wanted to humiliate her. That was the only reason. He wanted her to show up in her old maternity clothes, looking tired and worn down, so he could point at her and say to his high society friends, "Look what I escaped." "Mama." Natalie looked down. Leo had rolled over and was looking at her with wide blue eyes, eyes that looked so much like Richard's, it sometimes made her heart ache. But Leo's eyes were kind. "He thinks we're trash, Leo," she told the baby softly. "He thinks Mummy is just a bitter ex-wife." She walked to the window, looking out at the grey city. She should throw the invitation in the trash. She should burn it. She should stay here safe in her bubble of struggle and love. But then her phone buzzed. It was a notification from Instagram. Tiffany Banks had tagged her in a post. Natalie hadn't followed her, but her profile was public. It was a photo of the invitation. The caption read, "Sent an invite to the past today. Hopefully she comes so she can see how much better the future looks. Upgrade / future Mrs. Hall." Natalie's grip on the phone tightened until her knuckles turned white. It wasn't just an invitation. It was a public spectacle. If she didn't go, she looked weak. If she went, she looked desperate. "I need a drink," she muttered, though she settled for a glass of water. As she stood in her small kitchenette, a knock echoed on her door. It was a heavy, authoritative knock. Not the delivery guy. Not the landlord. Natalie checked the peephole. Standing in the hallway was a man she had never seen before. He was older, perhaps in his late 50s, wearing a suit that cost more than her car. He had silver hair and a posture that screamed military or old money. She unlocked the chain and opened the door an inch. "Can I help you?" The man bowed slightly. "Ms. Natalie Thorne." "Yes. My name is Alfred. I am the personal attaché to Mr. Alexander Hall." Natalie frowned. Hall related to Richard. Distantly and unhappily. Alfred said, a small conspiratorial smile touching his lips. "May I come in?" "My employer has a proposition for you regarding the wedding invitation you just received." Natalie hesitated, looking back at the triplets. I don't know you." "Mr. Hall knows you, Natalie. Or rather, he knows of you. He knows what Richard did. And Mr. Hall is a man who despises bullies." Alfred pulled a tablet from his briefcase. "He is waiting in the car downstairs. He would like to offer you a ride. And a plan." "A plan for what?" "For the wedding," Alfred said. "Richard Hall is a millionaire, Ms. Thorne. But Alexander Hall, he owns the bank Richard keeps his money in, and he believes it is time the bride and groom learned a lesson in humility." Natalie looked at the invitation on the counter, then at her babies, and finally back at the mysterious man. Her heart hammered against her ribs. This was crazy. It was dangerous. "Let me get the diaper bag," she said. The car downstairs was not just a car. It was a Rolls-Royce Phantom idling silently against the curb of her run-down apartment complex, like a spaceship that had landed in a junkyard. Neighbors were peering out of their windows. Alfred held the door open, and Natalie, juggling 2 carriers, while Alfred held the third, slid into the plush leather interior. Sitting on the other side was a man who looked like he had been carved out of granite and dressed by Italian tailors. Alexander Hall was striking. He was younger than Alfred, maybe late 30s, with piercing grey eyes and a jawline sharp enough to cut glass. He didn't look like a billionaire. He looked like a king. "Natalie," he said, his voice deep and smooth. He didn't offer a hand. Instead, he leaned forward and looked at the babies. A genuine softness entered his eyes. "And 3 of them, Richard really is an idiot, isn't he?" "He doesn't know there are 3, Natalie said, buckling the carriers in with shaking hands. "He thinks there's 1, or none. He doesn't care." "He will," Alexander said, leaning back. "Drive Alfred." As the car glided into traffic, Alexander turned his full attention to Natalie. "I suppose you're wondering why a stranger is kidnapping you and your children." "The thought crossed my mind," Natalie said, surprising herself with her boldness. "Are you really his cousin?" "Second cousin. We share a great-grandfather and a last name. That is where the similarities end. Richard inherited a construction firm and thinks he is a god. I built a global tech conglomerate, and I know I am merely a man with resources." Alexander tapped his fingers on the armrest. "I received an invitation to this wedding as well. It seems Richard wants to show off to the rich branch of the family." "So why do you need me?" "I don't need you, Natalie. I want to help you. I saw what he did to you. It was distasteful, public, cruel." Alexander's eyes darkened. "I have a particular disdain for men who abandon their responsibilities. When I heard he invited you to mock you, I decided I wanted a date." Natalie blinked. "You want me to be your date?" "No," Alexander corrected. "I want you to be my fiancé." The silence in the car was deafening. Even the triplets seemed to stop wiggling. "I beg your pardon? For the weekend," Alexander clarified, a mischievous glint in his eye. "The wedding is in the Hamptons. 3 days of festivities. If you show up alone, you are the pity case. If you show up with me, Alexander Hall, the man Richard has been trying to impress his entire life on your arm, wearing a ring worth more than his house. You are not the victim. You are the one who won. You want to pretend to be engaged. That's like a bad movie plot." "Life is a bad movie, Natalie. We just need to write a better script." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a velvet box. He flipped it open. Inside sat a yellow diamond the size of a quail egg, surrounded by a halo of flawless white diamonds. "This belongs to my grandmother. She was a terrifying woman. She would have loved you." Natalie stared at the ring. It was beautiful. It was a weapon. "Why would you do this for a stranger?" she asked, searching his face for deceit. "Because Richard is trying to merge his company with one of my subsidiaries next month. He thinks this wedding is the place to seal the deal. I want him to know that the woman he threw away is the woman holding the keys to his future." Alexander smiled, but it wasn't warm. It was predatory. "And because I like triplets, they're efficient." He looked at her, waiting. "So, Natalie, do you want to go to the Hamptons and burn his ego to the ground, or do you want to go home?" Natalie looked at the ring. She thought of Richard's note. "Bring the kid if you kept it." She thought of Tiffany's hashtag. "Upgrade." She reached out and took the box. "Does it fit?" "If it doesn't," Alexander said, "we'll resize it before we land." "Land? The jet is waiting at Boeing Field. We have a wardrobe fitting in New York in 4 hours. You can't wear Seattle rain to a Hamptons wedding." The next 48 hours were a blur of luxury Natalie couldn't have imagined in her wildest dreams. They flew on a Gulfstream G650. The triplets had their own nanny on the flight, a kind British woman named Mrs. Higgins, who Alexander had on speed dial. For the first time in 6 months, Natalie slept for 5 uninterrupted hours while soaring at 40,000 feet. When they landed in New York, a fleet of SUVs whisked them to a penthouse overlooking Central Park. But there was no time to admire the view. A team of stylists was waiting. "She has good bones," a woman with purple hair muttered, tilting Natalie's chin up. "But she looks tired. We need to fix the skin. Hydrate. Glow." "The hair," another stylist said. "Dark chocolate. Glossy. We're going for old Hollywood revenge." Natalie stood like a mannequin as they worked. She was stripped of her spit-up, stained leggings and oversized t-shirt. She was scrubbed, polished, and painted. Alexander sat in the corner of the room working on a laptop, occasionally glancing up to nod approval. He wasn't controlling. He was curating. "The dress," Alexander said, pointing to a rack that had been rolled in. "Not the red one. Too cliché. Everyone expects the woman in red moment." "Then what?" the stylist asked. "The gold," Alexander said. "She should look like a trophy, the one he couldn't afford to keep." The dress was a custom Versace, a shimmering column of liquid gold that hugged every curve she still had and accentuated the ones she had gained. It had a slit that went up to her thigh and a neckline that was daring but elegant. When Natalie stepped out of the room went silent. She looked in the mirror and didn't recognize herself. The exhausted single mum was gone. Staring back was a goddess, a warrior queen dipped in starlight. "Perfect," Alexander said, standing up. He walked over to her and took her hand. He slid the massive yellow diamond onto her finger. It fit perfectly. "You look dangerous," he whispered. "I feel terrified," she admitted. "Good. Fear keeps you sharp. Now about the story. We met in Paris 6 months ago. I was acquiring a vineyard. You were strictly researching art." "I've never been to Paris," Natalie said. "You have now. We fell in love instantly. You didn't tell me who your ex was until I got the invitation. I was furious, but you being the saint, you are convinced me to come to make peace." Natalie laughed. "So I'm the saint?" "In public, yes. In private, you can be as petty as you like." He checked his watch. "The helicopter leaves in 20 minutes. The rehearsal dinner is tonight. We need to make an entrance." "What about the babies?" "Mrs. Higgins and a security team will bring them in a separate vehicle. They will stay in the guest cottage of the estate I've rented next to the venue. We will reveal them. Strategically." "Strategically. At the ceremony," Alexander said. "Trust me." The rehearsal dinner was held at the Hall Vines, ironically a vineyard that Richard had been trying to buy for 3 years, completely unaware that it was owned by Alexander's holding company. The sun was setting over the Hamptons, casting a burnt orange glow over the white tents and manicured hedges. Richard stood near the entrance, a glass of scotch in hand, looking every bit the master of the universe. He was wearing a navy linen suit that cost $5,000, and next to him, Tiffany was preening in a white cocktail dress that looked suspiciously like a wedding gown. She was clinging to his arm, flashing a diamond that was respectable, but certainly not a headline. "Do you think she'll come?" Tiffany asked, her voice tight. She probably couldn't find a babysitter or a dress that fits. Richard swirled his drink. "She'll come. She needs the closure. And honestly, I want her to see this. I want her to see that I didn't just move on, I moved up. At that moment, the hum of an engine cut through the ambient jazz music. It wasn't the sound of a taxi or a rental sedan. It was the deep, throaty purr of a V12 engine. Conversation stopped. Heads turned toward the gravel driveway. A midnight blue Rolls-Royce Phantom, extended wheelbase, rolled to a stop right in front of the welcome tent. It was flanked by 2 black Escalades. The valet stepped forward looking terrified, but the driver of the lead Escalade hopped out first, a massive man with an earpiece, and opened the rear door of the Rolls-Royce. A polished black dress shoe stepped out, followed by Alexander Hall. He adjusted his cuffs, his tuxedo jacket tailored to perfection, looking like he owned the very air they were breathing. He walked around the car, ignoring the valet, and opened the passenger door himself. And then Natalie emerged. A collective gus rippled through the crowd. The woman Richard remembered, swollen, tear-stained, wearing oversized sweatpants, was gone. In her place was a vision dipped in liquid gold. The custom Versace dress clung to her body like a second skin, the slit revealing a long, toned leg that ended in a diamond-encrusted stiletto. Her hair was a cascade of dark silk down her back, and her makeup was flawless, highlighting cheekbones Richard didn't even remember she had. But it was the ring that caught the light and the breath in everyone's throat. The yellow diamond flashed like a lighthouse beacon. "Oh my God," someone whispered. "Is that Natalie?" Richard dropped his glass. It shattered on the pavers, splashing scotch onto his expensive shoes. But he didn't notice. He was paralyzed. Natalie took Alexander's arm, her chin held high. Her heart was pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs, but Alexander's grip was steadying a silent anchor. "Smile." Alexander murmured, his lips barely moving. "You own this place. Literally, you're with the owner." They walked up the path, parting the sea of guests like royalty. Richard recovered his senses enough to step forward, his face a mask of confusion and anger. Tiffany was gripping his arm so hard, her fingernails were digging into his suit. "Natalie," Richard choked out. Natalie stopped. She looked him up and down, offering a cool, detached smile. "Hello, Richard. Tiffany. Lovely venue." What is this?" Richard gestured to the car. The dress, the man. You look expensive," Alexander finished for him. The billionaire extended a hand, though his eyes remained cold. "Alexander Hall. I believe we're distant cousins, Richard, though we've never had the pleasure." Richard stared at the hand, then shook it limp. "Hall. You mean the Alexander Hall, Hall Global?" "The same," Alexander said smoothly. "Natalie and I have been together for some time. When she received your invitation, I insisted we come. I wanted to meet the man who was foolish enough to let her go." Tiffany let out a shrill, nervous laugh. "Together? But she was pregnant like 5 minutes ago. Where's the baby? Did you leave it with a neighbor?" The air grew icy. Alexander turned his gaze to Tiffany, looking at her as if she were a stain on the carpet. "Our children are with their nanny." Alexander lied effortlessly, claiming the children as a unit. "And we prefer not to discuss domestic logistics at a party. It's gauche." He turned back to Richard. "I heard you're trying to bid on the construction contract for the new Hall Tech headquarters in Austin." Richard's eyes widened. That contract was worth $200 million. It was the lifeline his company needed. Yes, we submitted the proposal last week. I had no idea you were." "I review every major bid," Alexander said. He pulled Natalie closer, kissing her temple. I usually don't mix business with pleasure, but Natalie has been telling me so much about your character. It's certainly given me a lot to consider regarding your application." Richard paled. He realized with a sinking horror that his business future was currently resting in the hands of the ex-wife he had discarded. "Shall we get a drink, darling?" Alexander asked Natalie, ignoring Richard completely. "We shall," Natalie said. As they walked away, she felt Richard's eyes burning into her back. But for the first time in a year, it wasn't a glare of judgment. It was a stare of longing and fear. The wedding morning was chaotic for everyone except for Natalie. While Tiffany was reportedly having a meltdown in the bridal suite because the florist had brought cream hydrangeas instead of ivory. Natalie was sitting on the private terrace of the guest cottage feeding Maya a bottle. The cottage was situated on the far edge of the estate, secluded by tall pines. It was the only reason Alexander had agreed to bring the triplets privacy. "You were incredible last night," Alexander said, stepping out onto the terrace with 2 coffees. He was wearing a casual cashmere sweater, looking unfairly handsome for 800 AM. "I was shaking," Natalie admitted, burping Maya gently. "Did you see his face? He looked like he'd seen a ghost." "He saw a regret," Alexander corrected. He sat down, stroking Leo's head as the baby kicked on a playmat. "But today is the real show. Are you ready for the ceremony?" "I don't know if I can do. The triplets reveal Alex. It feels cruel." Alexander's expression hardened slightly. "Natalie, do you remember the voicemail he left you when you asked for help with the medical bills? The one where he said you were draining his resources?" Natalie looked down. She remembered. She had been in the NICU, terrified because Sam had breathing issues, and Richard had told her to stop calling him. "He invited you to parade his new life in your face," Alexander said softly. "He wanted to show you that he replaced you. We aren't being cruel. We are simply showing him the reality of what he abandoned. He thinks he abandoned a burden. We are going to show him he abandoned a legacy." He checked his phone. "Alfred has arranged everything. The ceremony starts at noon. We will arrive at 12:05. Late, fashionably, and disruptively." Meanwhile, in the groom's suite, Richard was pacing. "Who is he?" Richard snapped at his best man. "How did she meet Alexander Hall?" "She was living in a shoebox apartment 6 months ago." "Maybe she was dating him while she was with you," the best man suggested unhelpfully. "No." Richard slammed his hand on the table. "She was obsessed with me. She was pathetic. There's no way." He walked to the window. He should be happy. He was marrying Tiffany, who was young and hot and didn't have stretch marks. But all he could think about was Natalie in that gold dress. She had looked regal, and the business deal. If Alexander Hall was influenced by Natalie, Richard was screwed. He needed to fix this. He grabbed his phone and texted Natalie. "Can we talk just for 5 minutes, before the ceremony? Please." Natalie saw the text pop up. She showed it to Alexander. "Don't answer," Alexander said. "Let him sweat." "The ceremony is in 2 hours," Natalie said, her stomach twisting. "What if he makes a scene?" "He won't," Alexander promised. "He's too concerned with his image. That's his weakness, and we're about to exploit it." Alexander stood up and clapped his hands. "All right, team. It's time. Mrs. Higgins, get the strollers. The triple strollers." The strollers were a custom design Alexander had flown in from Germany. Sleek black leather, connected in a way that looked like a tactical formation rather than a nursery run. "You're enjoying this too much," Natalie said, smiling despite her nerves. "I despise men who mistreat women," Alexander said, buttoning his jacket. "And I really, really hate bad fathers. Let's go to a wedding." The setting for the wedding of Richard Hall and Tiffany Banks was aggressively perfect. The sunken gardens of the Hampton estate had been transformed into a botanical fortress of white roses, hydrangeas, and imported Italian marble statues. The air smelled of expensive perfume and the salty tang of the nearby ocean, though the heat of the midday sun was beginning to bake the 200 guests sitting in their lucite ghost chairs. At the altar, beneath an archway that cost more than most people's college tuition, Richard stood waiting. He adjusted his silk tie for the 10th time, feeling a bead of sweat trickle down his spine. It wasn't just the heat. It was the silence. It was the weight of the eyes boring into his back. His investors, his board members, his judgmental mother, who had never really liked Tiffany. He should have been thinking about his bride. Tiffany was currently making her way from the manor house, presumably looking like a princess. But Richard's mind was elsewhere. He was scanning the second row of seats. 2 seats remained conspicuously empty. They were reserved for Mr. Alexander Hall and guest. He's not coming. Richard thought a mix of relief and terror churning in his gut. He came to the dinner to scare me, but he wouldn't crash the actual ceremony. It's too gauche for a billionaire. If Alexander didn't show, the merger was dead in the water. Richard needed that handshake today. He needed to prove to his shareholders that the Hall family branches were united. The string quartet swelled into Wagner's bridal chorus. The guests stood. The heavy oak doors of the garden opened, and Tiffany appeared. She looked stunning, if a bit stiff, her dress a massive confection of tulle that seemed to swallow her whole. As she began her walk smiling tightly, Richard forced himself to breathe. "It's happening. Just get through the vows." The priest, a man with a sonorous voice who clearly charged by the hour, began the liturgy. "Dearly beloved, we are gathered here today to witness the union of Richard and Tiffany." The ceremony droned on. It was safe. It was scripted. It was boring. And then the priest reached the critical juncture. He looked out over the crowd, his glasses slipping down his nose. "If anyone here knows of any lawful impediment, why these two should not be joined in holy matrimony, speak now or forever. Hold your peace." Usually this is the moment for a breathless silence, a formality that no one takes seriously. But today the silence was shattered, not by a voice, but by the crunch of heavy tires on gravel. It wasn't the distant sound of a car parking in the main lot. It was close, intrusively close. The sound came from the service entrance, a gated archway, directly to the right of the altar, meant for caterers and florists. Every head turned. Tiffany froze her bouquet, trembling in her hands. Richard squinted against the glare. A stretch limousine, distinctively longer and more aggressive than the bridal cars, had bypassed the valet entirely and pulled up right to the iron gates of the garden. The engine hummed with a low, vibrating power that seemed to shake the delicate flower arrangements. The driver's door opened. A uniformed chauffeur stepped out, marched to the rear passenger door, and swung it open. First came the shoe, a polished black Oxford. Then the man. Alexander Hall stepped onto the white gravel, adjusting the cuffs of his morning suit. He looked like a 1920s robber baron who had just bought the bank and evicted the tenants. He didn't look at the crowd. He turned back to the car and extended a hand. Natalie emerged. If last night she had been a golden trophy today, she was the embodiment of ethereal, untouchable grace. She wore a dress of pale lavender silk that flowed like water around her frame, high-necked and long-sleeved modest, yet devastatingly elegant. A wide-brimmed hat, tilted at a jaunty angle, obscured her eyes, giving her an air of mystery, that Tiffany's tool explosion completely lacked. "What is she doing?" Tiffany hissed, her voice cutting through the stunned silence of the altar. "Get security." But the security guards were confused. This was Alexander Hall. You didn't just tackle a man whose net worth was higher than the GDP of a small country. And then the real performance began. Natalie didn't walk toward the empty seats. She didn't walk toward Richard. She turned back to the open cavern of the limousine. From the depths of the car, Mrs. Higgins, the British nanny, stepped out. Then a second uniformed woman. Then a third. And then they unloaded the cargo. The strollers were matte black, sleek, and designed with military precision. They weren't just baby carriages, they were chariots. Alexander gestured for the nannies to stand down. He took the handle of the first stroller. He nodded to his head of security, a massive man named Gunther, to take the second. Natalie placed her manicured hands on the handle of the third. "Shall we?" Alexander's voice carried across the garden. They began to walk. They didn't use the side path. They didn't stay in the back. They steered the strollers onto the white runner, the very aisle Tiffany had just walked down, and began a slow, rhythmic march toward the altar. Crunch, crunch, crunch. The sound of the wheels on the runner was hypnotic. The guests were paralyzed. Phones were raised, recording the impossible scene. Richard felt the blood drain from his face, leaving him cold and dizzy. He looked at the strollers. 1, 2, 3. 3. They stopped 10 feet from the altar, creating a barricade between the couple and the guests. The string quartet had stopped playing, leaving only the sound of the wind in the trees and the soft gurgle coming from the first stroller. "Sorry for the interruption," Alexander announced, his tone conversational, as if he had just arrived late for lunch rather than destroyed a wedding. Traffic was a nightmare, and traveling with 3 infants is logistical. Richard took a step down from the altar, ignoring Tiffany's claw-like grip on his arm. He looked at Natalie, who was staring back at him with a calm, terrifying serenity. "Infants." Richard's voice was a cracked whisper. "Natalie, what is this?" "This," Natalie said, her voice clear, projecting to the back row without a microphone, "is the reason I was so hormonal when you threw me out, Richard." She reached down and lowered the canopy of her stroller. The crowd leaned forward. Inside lay Leo. He was awake, his wide, curious eyes scanning the strange faces. He had dark fuzz on his head and a chin that was undeniably, unmistakably a Hall chin. He was wearing a tiny bespoke tuxedo vest. A collective gasp ripped through the audience. It was a physical reaction, a wave of shock. "Leo," Natalie introduced him. Alexander lowered the canopy of his stroller. "And Sam." Sam was asleep, his fist curled against his cheek, looking like a cherub painted by Raphael. Then the security guard lowered the third. "And Maya," Natalie finished. Maya, seeing her mother, let out a delighted high-pitched squeal that echoed off the marble statues. It was the sound of pure life in a place that felt sterile and dead. Richard stumbled back as if he had been punched. He gripped the altar railing to stay upright. His eyes darted frantically from one baby to the next. The resemblance wasn't just there, it was aggressive. They were him. They were his face, copied and pasted 3 times over. "Triplets," Richard choked out. You had triplets. I tried to tell you," Natalie said, her voice dropping to a dangerous, icy register. "The week after you evicted me. I tried to call. I tried to text. I told your lawyer I had high-risk medical news. Do you know what he said?" Richard couldn't speak. He was shaking. He sent me a cease and desist letter. Natalie continued, pulling a folded piece of paper from her clutch. He said, and I quote, "Mr. Hall is not interested in your extortion attempts regarding the pregnancy. Any further contact will be considered harassment. He said you wanted a paternity test after the birth before you'd pay a cent." She let the paper drop to the ground. "Well, here they are, Richard. Leo, Sam, and Maya. 6 months old, and you haven't paid a cent." The crowd erupted into murmurs. Richard's mother, sitting in the second row, let out a sob, clutching her pearls. "My grandchildren. 3 of them." Tiffany, realizing her wedding was rapidly turning into a tribunal, snapped. She ran down the steps, her veil tangling around her legs. "Get them out!" she screamed, her face contorted with rage. "This is a setup." "She's lying. Those aren't yours, Richard. She probably adopted them just to ruin my day." "Security. Throw this trash out." At her scream, Sam woke up and started to cry. Alexander immediately scooped the baby up, holding him against his chest with a practiced ease that made the women in the audience swoon. He patted Sam's back, glaring at Tiffany with pure disdain. "I would lower your voice," Alexander said, his voice low and menacing. "You are scaring my godson." "Godson," Richard whispered. He looked at Alexander holding the baby, his baby. You're raising them." "Someone has to," Alexander said, turning his cold grey eyes on Richard. "You were too busy looking for an upgrade to notice you were throwing away a dynasty. Do you have any idea how rare spontaneous triplets are, Richard? Do you have any idea the strength it took for Natalie to carry them alone, to deliver them alone, to raise them alone for 6 months while you planned flower arrangements?" Richard looked at his investors in the front row. Mr. Henderson, the key vote for the merger, looked disgusted. He was shaking his head, closing his portfolio. "I didn't know," Richard pleaded, looking at Natalie. "Nat, I swear, if I had known there were 3, if I had known they were boys—" "That's the problem, Richard," Natalie said, stepping closer, her eyes blazing. "You only care because there are 3. You only care because 2 are boys. If it had been just 1 girl, I'd still be in that apartment, wouldn't I?" "You don't want to be a father. You want heirs." "We can fix this," Richard said, panic rising in his chest. He looked at the babies, his legacy. "We can. I have rights. I'm their father." "Biologically, yes," Alexander interjected, stepping between Richard and Natalie like a human shield. "But financially, morally, legally, you are a stranger." Alexander reached into the inside pocket of his jacket. He pulled out a thick, cream-colored envelope sealed with the Hall Global crest. "I came here for 2 reasons, Richard," Alexander said. "First, to support Natalie, who is the strongest woman I have ever met. And second, to answer your proposal regarding the merger between Hall Construction and my tech division." Richard's eyes widened. "Alexander, please. Not here. Not now." "You invited me here," Alexander reminded him. "You wanted a public show of support, so here is my public answer." He tossed the envelope. It hit Richard's chest and fell to the white runner, landing right next to the stroller wheel. "The answer is no," Alexander declared. "I do not do business with men who lack integrity. I do not entrust my capital to men who abandon their own blood. If you can't manage your own family, Richard, you certainly cannot manage my infrastructure." The silence that followed was absolute. That envelope wasn't just a rejection, it was a bankruptcy notice. Without that deal, Richard was over-leveraged and exposed. "You ruined me," Richard whispered, tears finally spilling over. "You came here to ruin me." "You ruined yourself," Natalie said. She leaned in, her voice soft but audible to everyone nearby. "I just brought the mirror. so you could watch it happen. She turned to Alexander. I'm ready to go. Leo is getting fussy. Of course, darling, Alexander said. He placed Sam back in the stroller with infinite gentleness. They turned the strollers around in a synchronized movement. Wait! Tiffany shrieked, realizing her billionaire husband was now a broke pariah with 3 secret kids. She ripped her veil off her head and threw it on the ground. I'm not signing the marriage certificate. I'm not marrying a deadbeat. This wedding is over. As Natalie and Alexander began the long walk back up the aisle, chaos erupted behind them. Tiffany was screaming at Richard. Richard was on his knees, reaching out toward the retreating strollers. Richard's mother was trying to push past the ushers to run after her grandchildren, but Natalie didn't look back. She kept her head high, her hands on the stroller, walking toward the open gate where the sun was shining. That went well, Alexander murmured as they cleared the blast zone of the garden. He looked so small, Natalie noted, surprising herself. I thought he would look scary, but he just looked small. Perspective, Alexander said, glancing at the 3 babies. It changes everything. As they reached the limo, the driver held the door. Natalie paused, looking at the man who had orchestrated this symphony of revenge. Thank you, she said. Don't thank me yet. Alexander smiled, a genuine warm smile that reached his eyes. We still have to get 3 car seats back into the jet. That is the real challenge. Behind them, the sounds of the wedding imploding grew louder. But inside the limo, as the heavy door thudded shut, there was only quiet and the soft cooing of a family that had finally found its protector. The fallout from the wedding of the century was less of a scandal and more of a cultural event. The video of the triplet reveal didn't just go viral, it became a global phenomenon. Within 48 hours, the 14-second clip of Natalie and Alexander marching down the aisle with 3 strollers had accrued 70 million views. The hashtag #HallTripletRevenge trended on Twitter for 3 days straight, eclipsing the actual news cycle. For Richard, the consequences were swift, brutal, and mathematical. On Monday morning, Hall construction stock plummeted by 22%. By Wednesday, the board of directors held an emergency meeting. They didn't care about his infidelity. They cared about the public rejection by Alexander Hall. Alexander's envelope, the rejection of the merger, was viewed by the market as a death knell. By Friday, Richard was voted out as CEO of his own company. Tiffany didn't even wait for the stock to hit bottom. She filed for an annulment on the grounds of fraud, claiming Richard had misrepresented his financial status and family baggage. She gave an exclusive interview to Vanity Fair titled "I Was the Victim Too," which nobody believed but everyone read. But miles away from the chaos in the quiet, tree-lined streets of New York's Upper West Side, Natalie was finally breathing. 3 months had passed since the Hamptons. Life had settled into a rhythm that was exhausting, but beautiful. She wasn't living in the penthouse anymore. She had insisted on independence. Alexander had found a compromise, a stunning, historic brownstone near the park, owned by his real estate trust, which he leased to her for the symbolic price of $1 a month until her new business got off the ground. And her business was flying. Natalie had launched the Phoenix Collective, a consultancy firm helping women navigate high-conflict divorces and financial recovery. Her waiting list was already 6 months long. It was a Tuesday evening, and a heavy grey rain was battering the city. Inside the brownstone, however, it was warm. The smell of roasted chicken and baby powder filled the air. Natalie was in the living room, folding a mountain of tiny laundry, when the intercom buzzed. It was an insistent, desperate sound. She checked the monitor. Her heart skipped a beat, then hardened into a cold stone. Standing on her stoop, soaked to the bone, was Richard. He looked like a ghost of the man she had known. His hair was matted to his forehead, his suit was ill-fitting, likely off the rack, and his eyes were hollowed out by stress and sleepless nights. Natalie hesitated, then walked to the front door. She didn't open the heavy oak door. She only opened the small iron-barred viewing gate. "Richard," she said, her voice flat. "You're violating the restraining order." "Please, Nat." Richard's voice was broken, barely audible over the rain. "I fired my lawyers. I can't afford them. I need to talk to you, human to human. We stopped being human to human when you had security throw me onto the street while I was pregnant," Natalie replied, clutching her cardigan tighter around herself. "Go home." "I don't have a home." Richard snapped a flash of his old temper flaring before extinguishing into misery. "The bank took the house in Bellevue. Tiffany took the apartment. I'm staying in a motel in Queens, Natalie. A motel." He gripped the cold iron bar's water dripping from his nose. "I know I messed up. I know I was cruel. But they're my children. I saw the pictures in the magazines. Leo, he looks just like my father. I have a right to know them. I have a right to be a father." "Rights?" The deep, rumbling voice came from the shadows of the hallway behind Natalie. Richard flinched as Alexander stepped into the light. He wasn't wearing a tuxedo today. He was wearing jeans and a soft grey sweater, his sleeves pushed up, looking effortlessly dominant in Natalie's domestic space. "Alexander," Richard hissed, "still playing the white knight. I'm not playing anything, Richard. Unlike you, I don't treat family as a performance." Alexander moved next to Natalie, his presence a warm wall of protection. He pulled a folded document from his back pocket. "You mentioned rights," Alexander said calmly. "Do you remember the document your lawyer drafted 7 months ago? The paternity denial and waiver form?" Richard blinked, confused. That was standard legal posturing. I didn't mean it." "The law doesn't care about your intent. It cares about your signature," Alexander said. "You signed a document stating that you denied paternity until a DNA test was performed after the age of 1 year. You also waived all medical decision-making and custody rights during that interim period to avoid financial liability." I was angry. I was trying to protect my assets. "And in doing so, you abandoned your children," Alexander said, his voice dropping to a low, lethal register. "Since you refused to pay child support, refused to acknowledge them on the birth certificates, and signed away your rights, the state considered them abandoned." Richard's face went pale. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that adoption proceedings are surprisingly swift when you have the best lawyers in the world, and the biological father has a documented history of negligence," Alexander revealed. "Adoption," Richard whispered. He looked at Natalie. You let him adopt them." "I didn't let him do anything," Natalie said, her voice trembling with emotion. "He stepped up Richard. He was there for the colic. He was there for the fevers. He was there when I was crying because I was so tired I couldn't see straight. He didn't ask for a DNA test. He just asked how he could help." "The papers were finalized this morning," Alexander added, holding up the document. "Legally, they are Leo, Sam, and Maya Hall, but not your branch of the Halls, Richard. Mine. They are my children now." Richard stared at them. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. He hadn't just lost his wife or his money. He had lost his legacy. He had lost the immortality that children provide. "I have nothing," Richard sobbed, sliding down the iron gate until he was kneeling on the wet concrete. "I have absolutely nothing." You have your freedom, Natalie said, her voice surprisingly gentle, though devoid of pity. You wanted a life without clutter. You wanted to be unburdened. You're free, Richard. Go enjoy it. She reached out and closed the heavy wooden door, the thud echoing with finality. She slid the deadbolt home. The silence in the hallway was heavy. Natalie leaned her forehead against the wood, taking a shaky breath. Are you okay? Alexander asked softly. I feel... Natalie turned to face him, a tear sliding down her cheek. I feel light. Like a weight I've been carrying for a year just vanished. Good, Alexander said. He reached out and wiped the tear away with his thumb. Because I don't want you carrying any more weight. That's my job of now. He took her hand and led her away from the door, back toward the warm glow of the living room. But he stopped at the bottom of the staircase. Natalie, he started, and for the first time since she'd met him, the billionaire looked nervous. He ran a hand through his hair. I realized something today, while I was signing the adoption papers. What? I realized I did this whole thing backward. He let out a short, self-deprecating laugh. I played the husband to punish your ex, then I became the father to protect the kids, but I skipped the most important part. He reached into his pocket. Natalie's breath hitched. Alex. He knelt down. It wasn't like the moment in the private jet where he had handed her a massive yellow diamond, like a prop for a play. This felt raw, intimate. He opened a small velvet box. Inside wasn't a rock the size of a quail egg. It was a platinum band set with 3 deep blue sapphires and 1 brilliant white diamond in the center. The yellow diamond was for the cameras, Alexander said, looking up at her with eyes full of absolute devotion. It was a costume. But this is real. He took the ring out. The 3 sapphires are for Leo, Sam, and Maya, because they are part of the deal. They are the foundation. And the diamond, that's you, the center of it all. Natalie covered her mouth with her hand, tears welling up again. I don't want to pretend anymore, Natalie, Alexander whispered. I don't want a fake fiancé for the gala season. I want a partner. I want to wake up in this house with you every day. I want to argue about whose turn it is to change diapers. I want to be your husband, not for revenge, but for love. He took her hand, his fingers warm and steady. Natalie Thorne, will you marry me? For real this time? Natalie looked at the ring, then at the man who had used his empire not to conquer her, but to shield her. She thought of Richard, cold and alone in the rain, chasing a life of surface-level perfection. And then she looked at Alexander, who was offering her a life of messy, chaotic, beautiful reality. She dropped to her knees so she was eye-level with him. She wrapped her arms around his neck, burying her face in his shoulder. Yes, she whispered, her voice fierce. Yes, yes, yes. Alexander let out a breath of relief and kissed her a deep, soul-sealing kiss that felt like coming home. From the nursery upstairs, the baby monitor crackled. A unified chorus of 3 waking babies began to wail. Alexander pulled back, laughing against her lips. The board of directors is awake. We should go take a meeting. Natalie smiled, wiping her eyes. After you, Mrs. Hall, Alexander said, helping her up. Not yet, she teased, taking his hand and leading him up the stairs. But soon. And that is how you serve revenge, not with a scream, but with a signature. Natalie didn't just survive Richard's cruelty. She transcended it. Richard wanted a life free of responsibility, and in a twist of poetic justice, that is exactly what he got total isolating freedom. Meanwhile, Alexander proved that being a father isn't about biology. It's about showing up. This story is a powerful reminder that sometimes the worst thing that happens to us is just clearing the path for the best thing. What do you think about the ending? Did Richard deserve to lose his parental rights? Or was that too harsh? I really want to read your debates in the comments. If you enjoyed this roller coaster of drama, karma, and romance, please smash that like button and subscribe to the channel. Turn on notifications so you never miss a story. Thanks for watching.